Welcome, Frances Lappé. Welcome, Anna Lappé. Welcome to all on this Mother's Day Sunday. We didn't do a sound check, and forgive me, my world is radio, so I'm going to adjust my sound a little bit. Welcome all on this Mother's Day Sunday here to the Bay Area Book Festival. Could you be in a better place here for this conversation with one of the most dynamic mother-daughter duos, visionary daughters on this small, hot planet? Thanks to the Bay Area Book Festival for gathering us all for this conversation and the dozens of conversations that have been happening this weekend. This conversation is being presented in collaboration with Bioneers, who's a sponsor of the event, and we thank them. We're here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Diet for a Small Planet, which I just learned in the green room was written and begun only blocks from here in Berkeley. And the entire book, probably most of you know this, was written here in Berkeley. So we're going to be digging deep into that story. And I just wanted to start with a quote before we get into it that I found when I was researching both of these women. And I think it says so much. Frances, I believe this is a quote of yours that I'm saying. Yes, there's a crisis. Oh, I'm Davia Nelson of the Kitchen Sisters, and I'm your moderator. Forgot that part. I feel like a racehorse. I feel like a secretariat because I want to use every minute to be in conversation with these women. I want to also say that we will have questions from you all, and that'll be 20 minutes in. So if I just start losing track, somebody from the audience say, yo, questions time, our turn. Also, Green Apple Books is outside and going to be selling their books, and you want to have them in your library for this generation and for the next. Okay, here's the quote that got me. Yes, there's a crisis of hunger on the planet, but hunger is not caused by the scarcity of food, but the scarcity of democracy. So, with that in mind, I'm just going to say one last thing before I give it to Frankie. I was on the phone yesterday with Alice Waters, and she was saying, what are you doing tomorrow? I said, I'm going to be in conversation with these two amazing women. And she said, oh my God, Diet, this I quote, Diet for a Small Planet, it was the book. It shook our world. It became our credo. It woke us up. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and Diet for a Small Planet. And it is still so relevant now more than ever. And she said, and I'm going with Anna tomorrow to Sacramento for a conversation with Governor Newsom and Jen about a conference on farm-to-school agriculture. So with those words, welcome.
Thanks so much, Davia. I was just telling Davia that quote that she read about democracy, that is like my mother's, I want, that banner that democracy is not caused by, hunger is not caused by a scarcity of food, but a scarcity of democracy. I just found out that was a title card in a Queer Eye episode. So I was like, my mom has really gone mainstream, that this message is in Queer Eye. It speaks to, yes, she's been saying this for 5 decades now, but really, yeah. So Mom, do you want to jump in?
Oh, I'm so grateful to be here. So much of my heart life has been here. I've raised my kids here. If you do that, do you raise kids? No, you allow them to be these incredible people. So I have done a lot of reflection because Anna so encouraged me and so helped on the 50th anniversary edition. I want to give her just incredible amount of credit for the fact that it happened and so beautifully. So, it's been a time of great reflection, like what have I learned? What have I learned? And so many things, but one of them that I hope we can all appreciate is the power of fresh eyes. Because I was just a kid. I had started out in the war on poverty. I was a child of that era in the Great Society and working very closely with low-income people in Philadelphia. And the woman I worked most closely with in her 40s died of a heart attack, a very poor African American woman. And I knew that Lily had died of poverty, not of a heart attack, really. But I didn't know how my life was addressing the causes of my beloved Lily's death. And so I had the great opportunity because her wonderful father, Mark Lappé, was a postdoc at Berkeley, and I had access to the library. And I thought, oh, food, if I could just understand why there is this great suffering around food, maybe it would take me to the root causes, and I would really begin to understand the mysteries of economics and politics and understand why Lily died so unnecessarily so young. And I was so blessed to have that opportunity, but perhaps that was the best decision, one of the best decisions, to just begin asking. And so I just went to the library and literally, with my dad's slide rule, some of you remember what a slide rule is, right? I literally put two and two together and then said, what? Paul Ehrlich is wrong. We haven't hit the Earth's limits. There is no population that is causing the problem. And so that was the aha moment for me, that we all have the capacity, no matter how great the expertise and all of these memes that are shaping us, that maybe we shouldn't take them for granted. Maybe we should question. And so that beginner's eyes, but the second, how long should I speak?
You should
I
speak.
wanna,
You have a lot to say.
I'll just say one, the other big takeaway that I've continued to refine the language around, but I realized that our big brains, they're great, but they also are dangerous because we, unlike any other species, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. We see through filters. Those filters are stories we tell ourselves. And I love it that both Plato and the Hopi Indians have a saying that he who tells the story rules the world. And the story that we were being told and sharing was a story of limits of absolute material scarcity, not a story about power and who is deciding and how do we relate to the earth in a way that not just we can eat, but all future generations. And so I realized, oh, it's not seeing is believing. I ditched that notion. And I started saying believing is seeing. That unless we can see the filters that are so limiting us, we'll never create a sustainable life on Earth. And we will continue to undercut whether it's the climate crisis or biodiversity or all of the other threats facing us. We can't do it unless we can crack those limiting frames. And certainly the scarcity scare, as I call it, still we're trapped in so many ways with this idea, oh, if we can just make agriculture more efficient, and that then takes the brain to corporate chemical agriculture. No, the least efficient is what it really is. So it's, I'm sort of jumping around in my life's work, but these are the two strongest takeaways I have this morning. Is just that memory of being in the library and thinking, oh, I could just add up the numbers myself and I could see, is it right that there is more than enough for all of us to eat well? And I guess I have to also confess I was terrified when I came up with numbers that so flew in the face of the experts. And I remember sitting on the couch with my mom and saying, Mom, what if I got 1 decimal point wrong? And the whole thing is garbage. But as it turned out, my numbers were good, and there was and is, even more so today, more than enough. We've increased the per person food supply by about 20% since I wrote Diet for a Small Planet. And yet today, 1 in 3 people on Earth don't have access to adequate food. And the most heartbreaking statistics about the experience of scarcity, no matter how much there is in reality, is that 1 in 5 children under the age of 5 is stunted by malnutrition. And a lot of you, I'm sure, know stunting is not just being short. It involves a lot of limitations throughout life if you're stunted at that young age. So, it's so many things I could say, but you know, the the heart dance between how much we're still trapped, and yet, and this is where my daughter's work comes in especially, is how much more we know and how much more is spreading of what I call possibility. Uh, I've decided I'm not an optimist, and we don't have to be. All we have to sense as a possibility that we can make a turn now that we're in this state of crisis. We can make a turn toward life. And so I call myself a possibilist.
Love that term. There's a
So-
quote of Terry Tempest Williams that says, "Collaboration is the only way forward." And I feel like you two represent that as more than almost anyone. I know Anna, well, it being Mother's Day, I had a lot of questions about, Frankie, please describe Anna's birth. Anna, please describe growing up. What's your earliest memories in your home of these parents, these extraordinary parents that are young and blowing everyone's mind in the world about chemicals and about toxins and food. But here you are. There's Diet for a Small Planet. There's Diet for a Hot Planet. Why don't you let's bring that book into the conversation as well. And will you say the full title, because I love it so?
Sure. Thanks, Davia. Yeah. So the first book I ever wrote, not that I ever intended to be a writer like my mom, who's now written, I think, 20 books, right, Mom? Something like that. But the first book I ever wrote was a book with my mother. It's called Hope's Edge, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it in a second. But it was a book that I really encouraged my mom to write, and then she asked a favor of me to help her work on it. And we ended up writing this book together. I was 26. I was the age my mother was when she wrote Diet for a Small Planet. She was just 26 when she wrote that book. And so then we had this kind of full circle experience of there I was at 26 working on this book with her together. But flash forward a few more books. The last book I wrote, which was actually due to the publisher the day my first daughter was due. So I was like, I have a really hard deadline here. I really have to turn this in. But the book is called Diet for a Hot Planet. All of you, I'm sure, can tell who I was paying homage to with that title. Diet for a Hot Planet, the climate crisis at the end of our fork and what we can do about it. And in so many ways, not only in its title, but in its essence, it was really my attempt to kind of continue the life's work of my mother and to kind of carry on the story of Diet for a Small Planet to this moment where the climate crisis is so clearly one of the most existential crises of our planet, and to try to help people understand how food, what we grow, how we grow it, who gets to grow it, what we eat, how all of that is integrally connected to the climate crisis in a way that when I started working on the book more than a decade ago, I wasn't hearing anybody talk about. And yet the food system contributes about a third, now almost 37% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the food sector. So if we know we have to tackle this crisis, food has to be part of that story. What I also discovered in reporting the book, which was part of the sense of possibility that I share with my mother, is that the very diet she talks about in Diet for a Small Planet, this plant-centered whole foods, not the grocery store chain, but real whole food, that diet grown ecologically in concert with nature is the diet we need to be embracing to have a stable climate. And that farmers who are adopting these ecological practices are among the most resilient. So in climate change speak, those farmers are helping to mitigate the crisis and also adapt to it. And so in writing that book, it was both to kind of ring the alarm that we have to talk about agribusiness alongside talking about the fossil fuel companies, and that we have to also see farmers as a central piece of the story of the climate crisis, and that supporting farmers who are growing food ecologically, who want to transition in that direction, is such a critical piece. So that was Diet for a Hot Planet in my quickest nutshell.
Could you just say some of what those agricultural practices are? I hear that term, regenerative agriculture, and I think a lot of people know the term, but maybe don't have just quickly lay that out.
Sure. And there, I'm sure you all here we are in Berkeley, are all familiar with many of these regenerative or organic agriculture, which is we actually have a government certification for those practices, or the term agroecology. But broadly speaking, the way my mom and I see it is fundamentally about a food and farming system that centers knowledge, versus centering fossil fuel inputs. So we can think of it as knowledge intensive farming versus input intensive. So on the one hand, you have a way of farming that requires that you use synthetic fertilizer, petroleum-based pesticides, those kinds of inputs to do things like manage weeds and deal with pests and create abundance and high yields. On the other hand, when you're talking about these ecological practices, so agroecology, for instance, you're talking about a way of farming that is about understanding how to work with nature, bringing that knowledge onto the farm, understanding that in a lot of cases, what you might consider a weed is actually a really key part of the health of the soil. So it's focusing on biodiversity, planting trees on farms, and thinking about how you can work with the soil microbiology to create abundance. And I, with our own eyes, have seen the incredible abundance that that occurs when you work with nature. One of my most vivid memories when I was reporting on Diet for a Hot Planet was going to visit a farmer west of Madison, Wisconsin, and I wanted to visit his farm because he was using these agroecological approaches. And there had been a massive, very climate crisis style, a massive flooding event across the state just before I got there. And you know how it is, Davey, as an interviewer, we'd set up this interview weeks before, but I felt like the biggest jerk going to this farmer's property, assuming he had just lost everything from this flood. And I'm driving to his farm, and on either side of the road, the farms looked like lakes. They were completely covered in water. And my heart's racing as I'm imagining this is going to be a very different interview than I expected. And I show up to this guy's farm. He and his farm intern are swinging in hammocks on a porch in front of their wind-powered cider house, totally relaxed, in the gleaming. I'm like, what happened here, Mark? And he said, I took over this land just 13 years before from an input-intensive corn grower that all that farmer had been growing was corn, took it over 13 years before, and adopted all these ecological principles. He was growing more than 100 different crops. He built swales into the land that helped to direct the water as it cascaded from the sky. He had trees and shrubs and low-lying crops, and so as the water fell, it was not just pummeling the soil. And because he had focused on soil health, his soil was like the deepest, biggest sponge you could imagine. And as the rain came, it absorbed that rain. And he said he lost 3% of his crops in the low-lying field. And as he's telling me this story, you could look out and see all the corn growers around him and literally see the gullies that had been carved out of the soil from the pounding rain, and see how devastated all those farms were. And it was and all around me on his property were the buzzing bees and the birds. And on the recording, you'll appreciate this, Davia, you can hear the sound of the life on the farm. And so that's the kind of possibility that I hold in my mind's eye when I kind of get overwhelmed by the crisis. I kind of picture Mark hanging out in his hammock on this thriving farm in the middle of our Midwest.
I love that. Well, speaking of possibilities, I love that title, Hope's Edge, the next diet for a small planet. And I wonder if you two would talk about that book and your collaboration together. It's hard. There are 20 books from this, between them probably 25 books and maybe
Well, I will say that book, The Diet for a Hot Planet, was the last book I wrote. Then I had another kid. I don't know how my mom did it, raising 2 kids, but yeah.
Well, that's what made me want to ask you about what's your first memory growing up, because I figure in there lies some secrets, but we'll keep moving into the now.
Well, Hope's Edge emerged out of, in part, sort of a real troubled time in my life, and I needed an opening, a new energy. And Anna was in grad school at the time at Columbia, and I had this idea, and we got it together. If we could just travel the world and document the kind of story that Anna just told, but in different continents. And we ended up going on 5 continents and meeting people facing the greatest obstacles for the kind of change that all of our writing is about. And yet they turned out to be the most hopeful people that we'd ever met. And the big change for us, was coming home and said, wait a minute, these people that we met on all these continents, including Wangari Maathai in Kenya, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and the landless workers movement in Brazil, all over the world, we said, wait, they are facing the biggest obstacles, even being killed for their work. Certainly, Wangari suffered beating, and yet they seemed the most hopeful. And so out of that, we said, oh, hope is not what we find in evidence, it's what we become in action together. And that was sort of the slogan on our website for a long time. But that was life-changing, I think, for both of us. And in many ways, it reframed our whole idea of fear as something to avoid, and thinking of the fear that one would feel in many countries that we visited, India, Brazil, Kenya, where there was so much risk. And yet we were taught by a gentleman, Reverend Timothy Njoya in Kenya. He said, oh, no, fear is pure energy. You can do with it what you choose. And so later I started this kind of cheesy slogan about how, yeah, that pounding heart, that's just your inner applause telling you to go forward. So I think that was other than having my children, both of them here today, thank you, that sense of, this sense of, the possibility, that life-changing experience of meeting these incredibly courageous people, and their strength came from being in action together. And that, I think, our work is so informed by that.
Well, it's so interesting. We're fed so much fear. And the quote you said earlier, I think you said it was Plato who said it, about whoever controls story controls. And now what I'm feeling listening to the two of you is you have this wealth of statistics and this pool of research, and you know your shit, but you also have stories. And I think, what do they call humans are the storytelling animal, and that we need story as much as we need food. And how I look in this time when we are all so divided and fractured and so many issues, and I think, how do you break through? How do we connect one to another and open each other's minds? And I'm listening to you both going, there's some secret in that mix that both of you are offering,
Yeah, and I think with Hope's Edge, that was this really intentional part of our process. Was so we traveled to, as my mom was saying, India, Bangladesh, Poland, Kenya, France, and places across the U.S. Each of our chapters was a story of a place, a story of a social movement or a city government, even. But that was really a story of kind of social movements and organizing to really answer the provocation of that quote that Davia said at the very beginning, to answer that provocation of, so if hunger is not caused by a scarcity of food, but a scarcity of democracy, where in the world are there people and places and movements that are bringing that kind of democracy to life? And what would it look like if there was that kind of emergent democracy and organizing? And so we knew we wanted to tell those stories, but we also know humans, yes, we are so inspired by story, and also we are so grounded, and these movements are so grounded in the evidence, in the changes that you're able to actually document and see. And so we tell, for instance, in Hope's Edge, the story of this amazing city in Brazil called Belo Horizonte. I don't know if any of you have ever been there or heard of this city, but I think at the time it was the 4th largest city in Brazil. And we went there because there in 1993, a democratically elected city government came into power, connected with the labor movement in the city, connected with progressive politics, and they asked themselves a really basic question. If we were elected by the people of this city, and there are people in this city who are going hungry, isn't it kind of our job to figure out why there is hunger in this city? And isn't it our job to fix that? And so they took that on as their job and their mission and their mandate. And out of that kind of reframing, as my mother would say, kind of putting on a different set of glasses of what is the role of the public sector, what is the role of a city government, it unleashed incredible creative policymaking and incredible creative ideas. So doing some simple, when you think about it, but also brilliant things like looking at food that was going to waste in a lot of the publicly run daycares and food feeding centers, things like manioc leaves and eggshells that are actually highly nutritious. And they turned it into a high nutrient flour that they then used with products and prenatal clinics. And Mom, I know you just were looking at the statistics again
And
about
in
in school lunches and nursery schools, and the
schools, yeah.
statistics when we got there about incredible drops in infant mortality and incredible leaps in maternal health. And they did things like, there's a bunch of city-owned land, and they said, wait, that was sitting empty. Well, what if we made it available for free to local farmers to come in and sell their food? But in exchange for that free access in our urban centers, we required that they take their food out into the poorer neighborhoods. And I could go on and on because it was an incredible place, but it was this example of wanting to tell that story and share that sense of possibility, combined with really showing like they've analyzed this, like there is this incredible impact all on a fraction of the city government's budget. So
and cut child mortality in
Yeah.
half. And the other memory I have that symbolizes the spirit is that they developed what they call people's restaurants. Many, it's quite a number around the city, where anyone could get a great meal for equivalent of 75 cents. And homeless people could get meals for free. But what struck us so much, it had no stigma of like a soup kitchen or that any embarrassment, and the meals were great, and it just felt totally welcoming. It was a sort of, it was just, the setting was lovely and people were friendly, and it was just such a different approach because it was, we're all in this together. And I think it's cost, but all these multifaceted programs that reduce child mortality by half in a decade or so cost 2% of the city budget. 2%.
And that's just one of the many stories. What about the Small Planet Institute and the Small Planet Fund? You two have spawned, you've birthed, on Mother's Day, you've birthed
bring
lot
on the
of
metaphors,
projects.
Davia.
Yeah, okay. I had a whole intro about how fertile you both were with not just children, and then I decided, no. Okay, yeah. So Small Planet Institute. And
Well, the Small Planet Institute, I love community. And so Anna and I created the Small Planet Institute in Cambridge, where I had moved. And it is a very small operation that uses a lot of interns who come from all the great colleges in the area. And our mission is public education, to break through these myths that are so blocking us and to free people for hope and action together. And so we've published, I don't know how many books, but also other reports, and of course use social media. And we've also taken the lead in creating, because of this theme of hunger is not caused by scarcity of food, but democracy. We are now taking the lead in creating a Boston Democracy Circle, where leaders working for democracy forums come together in our office, and created a website I hope you'll all look at called democracymovement.us. And so we've taken the initiative with a very large partner, Washington-based partner, to help people who just want to know, what does that mean, democracy movement? And you can go there and jump to a map and see your state and see how you can engage right now in the most critical reforms to fix our very broken democracy. So that's part of what we do.
I notice the term living democracy and citizenship are throughout. If you look these two women up, you see food everywhere, but you also see democracy, citizenship, living democracy. What's that term, living democracy?
Well, living democracy, I started using that in the 1990s, and we had a Center for Living Democracy at that time. What I mean by that is democracy is not simply a structure of government. As we know, we can have the structure of government and still have incredible needless suffering. And so we try to help promote this frame of democracy as a way of life in which power is widely dispersed and we all have voice, in which public affairs are transparent, and in which we all feel a mutual accountability. You know, I often say, yes, we can point our fingers, but our finger has to come all the way around, that we're each on the hook for creating a more fair and just and working democracy. So that's part of what I mean by living democracy. It's a way of life that really is aligned with our nature. It's not something we do as some blah or painful duty. It is part of being human to have a sense of, you know, that I have a voice, I'm connected to others, and I have meaning in my life. And that's what living democracy suggests. So that's what I mean by it.
So what are you thinking with the midterm elections coming up? Where are you putting, any thoughts?
I don't know one single thing right now, but I would really, I would need to go to my own website. I've been, traveling, so I would really encourage us not to just take what I would say off the cuff, but to really look at what some of the leading democracy reform organizations are saying, the most important things we can do, the most important states to, get on the phone bank with, whatever it is that we can do, so.
Yeah, I agree everything my mom said, and what else would I add? I mean, I think that one of the messages that I feel like I'm sharing with all of you because I'm trying to internalize myself is, there are people in the media who it is their job to be pundits and to pontificate and to kind of predict and do the polling and tell us what is going to happen. But I am, as my mother is as well, a strong possibilist, and that I wouldn't want any of us to listen to the punditry and then say, oh, there's nothing we can do. We should just, not try to engage. That we kind of are the creators of the future if we are engaged. And that is the message I would share. And that through one of the other hats I wear, I work for a family foundation in the San Francisco Bay Area. And through that work involved with a lot of funders who are really trying to think creatively about how do you fund through 501c3 organizing, but fund the kind of long-term, decades-long work it will take to really create infrastructure across this country to protect the right to vote, to ensure that everybody, has that ability, that it's easy to vote, able to engage, and that we have candidates who really reflect our values. So there are many, many places to get involved, certainly, and I would just say, keep that spirit of possibility, particularly in the wake of last week.
Yeah. I'm going to jump back to food here for a moment. This is a quote of yours, Anna, and before I read it, do people know the singer and multimedia artist Laurie Anderson? You know who she is? She has this wonderful quote: If you think technology will solve your problems, you don't understand technology and you don't understand your problems. And I was thinking about that as I read your quote. To argue that we need some technology in order to produce food to tackle hunger is completely blind to the facts on the ground. Actually, what we need is the exact opposite of what GMOs give us. We have to empower farmers to grow food for themselves and plant and grow their own seeds and use practices to deal with weeds and the need for fertility, not from purchased products like a seed or a chemical, but from their own farms, from their own knowledge and their own skill sets. I know it's going back in the conversation a little, but I was very struck by that.
Yeah, I love that Laurie Anderson quote. Yeah. Oh, Laurie. Yeah, I mean, I think to kind of bring us back to this twinning of these conversations of food and climate, because I think we're at a moment where, uh, it is obviously clear how vital it is to take immediate action, to see, what can we do right now to take big, bold action. And the concern across all the sectors is that there's going to be a silver bullet technology that we can introduce and problem solve. And what we're seeing in the food and ag space, which is what I know well, is how the solutions that are getting the most traction, the most attention, that we're hearing the most loudly. Guess who benefits the most from those solutions? The largest companies, the largest corporations who stand to profit the most from those practices. So, for instance, corn-based ethanol was considered a technology. You'll take all the corn that we're growing in the Midwest, we'll turn it into fuel. It'll be this green technology. Advocates from the beginning of this proposition, of this so-called technology that will save us, have said the life cycle analysis of this is all wrong. No, this doesn't actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Actually, the amount of energy it takes to grow the corn, turn it into this fuel, and then use the fuel. No, it's not. It doesn't pencil out. People have been saying this for years, but today, more than half of corn, I think from the last statistics I saw from USDA, more than half of corn is still being used for corn-based ethanol. And there was just a new study out, it was reported in Reuters recently, I think it was in Nature, that yet again said it's something like it's 28 times more climate impactful to use corn-based ethanol than just to put gas in your car. So I really think we're at a moment where being really clear-eyed about these messages around what are the technologies being proposed, who stands to benefit from them, and are they really, are they actually going to really address the crisis? And so to be really careful about what some are calling false solutions, or and again, I think there's a lot of different examples. That's just one of them.
I just wanted to add something on
Please
here.
do.
I love everything you said, and it triggered for me this just one statistic, and that is I think that this technology is a solution. It's still this storyline of, oh, technology means more efficiency, right? Mm-hmm. That you have that connection in your head, oh, we just need more modern. And what that covers up and makes us blind to is the profound inefficiency built into the power structure of our food system. And just one stat on that we use overall on the earth, we use 80% of our agricultural land to produce livestock that provide us with 18% of our calories. So I think just that framing kind of blinds us to the profound inefficiency, and technology is not going to break that extreme inefficiency. It's the democratization of power that will do it.
Yeah. And just to add one more thing, I mean, the thing that really makes my blood boil about the conversation we often hear around the kind of technologies in chemical-dependent agriculture, many of the pesticides being used today are these antiquated pesticides that were innovated decades ago. It's not even we're really talking about new technologies. And so even though something like genetically modified organisms is kind of painted as an innovation, a breakthrough, what it has meant in terms of what have been commercialized in the marketplace, available to farmers for GMOs or genetically modified organisms, are only doing one of two things. Either they are expressing an insecticide, so kind of themselves a pesticide really, or they are resistant to weed killers. And the only innovation in the field is, are they resistant to one toxic herbicide, or two now, or three, or four? And many of the herbicides they're resistant to, again, these are some of the herbicides that were sprayed across Vietnam during the Vietnam War. These are some of the herbicides that we know are toxic. We've known are toxic for decades. So it's also interesting how, though, these pesticides get painted as if somehow that's innovative, and these GMOs are innovated, whereas the agroecological techniques are these like, those are kind of Luddites, and those aren't so innovated. So I think it's really thinking about what do we mean by innovation, and yeah.
let's bring you all into this conversation. The wonderful stage manager, there he is. So what we're going to ask is that, because this event is being recorded and will be up on the Book Festival site, so we're going to ask you to go over to the microphone, and he's going to be cleaning it between questions. So let's start.
Hi there. The discussion so far has painted a picture of amazing parent-child harmony and collaboration. But I can only assume that there have been differences in what to emphasize, what to pay attention to, how to balance storytelling versus policy rigor. And rather than pry, what do you think we can learn about collaboration from your own experience?
Oh, that is such a great
That's
question.
a great question.
Mom, do you want to?
Well, I think the key for me is that Anna and I had so many common experiences that led to the writing, that we shared these meeting people who changed our lives, like Wangari. And that is, I think, what made it possible. Or maybe I just got really lucky. But I don't remember any big difference in our writing, that we had to struggle to work out a difference. But I do think it's not like we were each reading different books and writing from that. We were actually experiencing together, right?
Yeah, and I think for our collaboration, I'll say, and I have had a lot of other collaborations, and in my work world right now, I feel like I'm collaborating with dozens of other colleagues. And one of the qualities of healthy collaboration I have found is actually one of the foundational principles of a healthy environment. It's diversity. It's like actually having differences, and it's also kind of having real niches and personalities. And so I never felt like I had to kind of subsume my voice inside my mother's. I feel like we both have our own styles, we both have our own voices, and that brought us, that there's a way you collaborate across those differences. But fundamentally, we share foundational core values. That means that through that collaboration, there wasn't any foundational conflict. But just to give you an example, like in the editing process of Hope's Edge, for example, one of the things I would do in the margins sometimes would sketch a little cheese slicer when I felt like my mom was getting a little too cheesy. She said that quote earlier about the inner applause being, that her heartbeat, she interprets that now as her inner applause when she's feeling fearful with that heartbeat. She said that was a little cheesy. And I said, Mom, it's okay, you can run with a few cheesy quotes, but just to give you an example of sort of how we had some
back,
nice,
Mom.
yeah, ebb and flow.
What I'm going to sneak in my question. Just give me one sec here. About growing up, like your little Anna Lappé growing up. You're 2, 3, 4, 5. What are you seeing in your house? What's going on there? Who's doing what?
Mm-hmm.
Where is she?
Mm-hmm.
What are you thinking?
So in the house, my older brother who's here, I will say, some of the things we're seeing, the things we're not seeing, definitely all the things you would imagine a Diet for a Small Planet kitchen would be, that was our kitchen. A lot of brown rice and beans and lentils. Somebody asked the other day, like, what was the junkiest junk food you had? And the only thing, and Anthony, correct me if you can think of something more junky than this, but the junkiest thing I could think of was rice crackers with peanut butter and honey. And I was telling this to a friend. She was like, Anna, there's no junk in, that's not junk food. So it was very like in the kitchen, very Diet for Small Planet. But what I also talk about when I think about our childhood is I think I was in a way maybe less influenced by the experience of the food. Kind of, it's your quotidian, it's what I grew up in, so it's like the air you breathe. I didn't think about it that much. But my mom and her institute at the time, the Institute for Food and Development Policy that she helped to co-found, was really involved in many things over its decades, but was really involved when I was a kid in Central American solidarity work and talking about the impact of US foreign policy in Central America. And so my most salient memories of my childhood was much more on the politics of her work than the food piece, and just the cuisine piece. So, going to demonstrations in San Francisco, in Central American solidarity demonstrations. She took my brother and me on a research trip to Guatemala, and I can still remember hiking up a hill above the city we were staying in and looking out and seeing these huge plantations, a couple huge plantations, and then clustered together, really like modest homes, and having this conversation with my brother and me and my mom about inequality, at a very young age. So those were kind of some of the things that I remember from my childhood.
And I'll also acknowledge that Anna started editing me when she was, I don't know, 12, 13, something like that. But so we've been working together a while.
In 1975, my high school girlfriend made me read the book. And I thought, there's just no negotiation, I had to read this. But I thought this was revealed truth, this was the light. But in all the years since then, I don't think I've met a single person who is familiar with the thesis of the book. And I lived in Berkeley for 45 years. I'm not sure the high school girlfriend remembers well. I don't think she cooks like that anymore. So I'll try to turn this into a question rather than just a despair. But Americans are so incoherent about diet. I mean, they really don't want the truth, it seems like. They just want to meet a new diet every 5 years, even informed people. I mean, one of the latest things is gluten-free. I mean, gluten is the protein part of wheat, and people believe inherently that gluten-free is somehow healthier than gluten. I mean, well, just reading this kind of thing, seeing this phenomenon causes despair in some people like me. So anyway, clearly you're more optimistic than me. So in that the truth was revealed, in my opinion, it didn't get discredited somewhere along the way, right? It's really so simple. But people didn't hear the gospel. They turned away. So, but you must find causes for optimism. There must be something that we haven't done.
Frances, what are you thinking as you're hearing him?
Well, certainly change in the direction that Diet for a Small Planet suggests is not happening fast enough. But now at 78, I am, I see enormous change in the sense that even in the 10 years that I've been in the Cambridge area and Harvard Square area, the number of wonderful plant-based, and now I call it plant and planet-based eating, because climate and so much else is involved, that it's, almost all around there are at least 4 right within a block of my office. And the organic acreage planted in the U.S. has increased over one 10-year period by 4-fold, and just the development of community gardens, and I think there are 29,000 community-supported agriculture now. So I know it's not fast enough to do what we've got to do, but I do see real change and people recognizing now, because the science is in about the health benefits of a plant-centered diet. And I think I love that term rather than vegetarian, because it opens, you don't have to be 100%, but move toward that world, that healthier world. So I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple thoughts really briefly, because I want to hear other questions. But really, briefly, just to reemphasize the sense of we are possibilists. I think you're absolutely right when you look at the fact that there are, what was it when we were working on the new edition of Diet for a Small Planet, and realizing that something on the order of magnitude of 67% of the calories that Americans eat come now from ultra-processed foods. No, that is not the progress we want to see. And yet, there is movement. There is the fact, so Davia mentioned tomorrow, Alice Waters and I, among others, are going to the governor's mansion to talk about this new release of a report on farm to school in the state of California. 20 years ago, do you know how many school-based edible gardens and farm-to-school programs there were in this country? Maybe not 0, but close to 0. Today, there are efforts like this in every single one of the states all across the United States. And so I think it is always to kind of move between that sense of, yes, we are not Pollyanna. Don't get us wrong here. We're very clear-eyed about what we're up against, but there is that sense of possibility. And then the final thing I'll say And I've asked my mom this question about, Mom, you've been saying the same thing for 50 years. How do do you ever feel despair about that? And we remind ourselves, do you think that the corporate executives that gather every year at the annual meeting for Coca-Cola sit around the boardroom and say, oh, it's terrible. We're still going to have to advertise again this year to get everybody to drink Coke? No, they know that storytelling, and as you know, Davy, as a storytelling, it is never ending. It is our work to keep telling those stories. So Coca-Cola still spends $6 billion a year in advertising. So those statistics about how much the processed foods industry, the sugary drinks industry has to spend to get us to go against our core desire for health is a sign that we are trying to push back against it too. So just adding those in. I think there are more questions.
Next, does someone else want to come on up?
Hi, thank you for everything you've done and written. I'm just curious, in terms of what has inspired you the most and where you've seen the most change. I say this as somebody who's worked at the global level for 25 years on global health and nutrition. If you look at the global action, the national level, and then the local level, besides all of the above, where do you see the most traction and where would you put the most energy going forward?
Great question.
You're asking about the United States, not the global picture, or both, or?
I'm saying for this audience, for those of us, let's say, who are based in California, but it could be anywhere. It's the payoff, the effort compared to the outcome, and what both your experience has been with that in terms of where the pressure points are and where one can genuinely change the story and the power structure.
And I'll just mention one global, where I'm headed, overview, and then if you could pick up on the U.S. But there's a gentleman named Jules Preti at the University of Essex, and his life passion is tracking the emergence of local, sustainable, cooperatively run initiatives around the world. And he had tracked by the year 2000 that there were 500,000 of these emergent self-empowered groups in 53 countries across the world. And then between 2000 and 2020, he was able to identify an additional 8 million that had emerged. The speed he was just astonished by it, and I trust him a lot. He has a team of people all over the world. So that I found so encouraging. So profoundly encouraging. And one of the pieces of that are these self-organized groups, particularly developing agroforestry, which is so healthy for the earth, so good for farmers because their income comes from, and their food comes from a diversity of sources, and so good in response to climate change. And so that particularly lifts me up. But Anna, if you would speak to the U.S.
Yeah, and also your question also is looking at the global picture too. I mean that your question feels like the $1 million question. Where are those pressure points? Or I think about it like the metaphor of acupuncture. Where are those acupuncture points where we can really see massive systems change? And so I know I feel like I could talk about this for hours because there's so much. And again, this is where I feel that sense of possibility. There's so much that I'm seeing that's really encouraging. So, what to share with all of you that I think would be most relevant. I'm sitting here. This is my first public event since the beginning of COVID, so it's a bit overwhelming. But I'm wearing this necklace because this necklace symbolizes one of these stories for me. I got this just before COVID hit in southern India, in Andhra Pradesh, and I was there as part of a global convening that was brought together by a funder group called the Agroecology Fund. And there were about 100 of us, some funders, but mostly social movement leaders. That it was like the amazing, amazing diversity of our planet brought together, from Peruvian indigenous potato farmers to activists from West African women's farming cooperatives to people from all around the world. And we went to Andhra Pradesh to learn from each other, but we went to that place in India because for me for many of us, holds this really powerful model of what's possible. And I think getting outside of the US context can sometimes be where possibility comes in. So in Andhra Pradesh, there was a farmer movement that emerged, pushing back against input-intensive agriculture, pushing for ecological principles, and collectively organized, started getting farmers off of the pesticide dependency, started seeing incredible health improvements, yield improvements, and this went from farmer to farmer education to scale up to tens of thousands of farmers, then hundreds of thousands of farmers, and putting political pressure on the government so that now this community-based natural farming, as they call it, is part of the agriculture department for that state in southern India. Part of their mission is to promote this community-based natural farming, and they have a vision of ultimately wanting to get every single one of the farmers in their state off of a dependency on fossil fuel-based synthetic fertilizer and toxic pesticides. And there's something now like almost 1 million farmers that are part of it now. So I raise this as just a story to convey that sense of the kind of movement that's happening globally that we in the US can tap into by connecting with some of the global environmental groups like Friends of the Earth that are helping to support some of those efforts, or if you have friends or colleagues that are funders through something like the Agroecology Fund, where we can help influence American philanthropy to fund that kind of effort. So it's just one example of a sense of possibility that comes to mind for me when I think about what's out
In
there.
Andhra Pradesh, I was there a few years before and met Dalit women, the lowest caste women. And Anna's heard this story because after I interviewed them about what they were doing, taking power where they had been totally oppressed by their husbands, by the power structure, and they were creating what Anna described. And after I talked to them, I was walking out of the village and they started racing after me. And they said, we forgot to tell you the most important thing. What we found, what mattered more than anything, we found our courage. And that, I think, speaks everything that we're talking about, of doing that which we thought we could not do, is what makes us then believe is become possibilist, and it's scary.
Do you two
Sorry.
travel with a tape recorder? Are you taping all this as you move through the world?
I should do that
Yeah.
more, like you, Davia.
Thank you.
Might I
Yeah.
urge you to add that as a part of make it a
If all of you don't
triumvirate.
listen to Davia, you all should. And those of you who do listen to the Kitchen Sisters, you know what an incredible storyteller Davia is and how she captures great voices.
It's so great to just see the 50th anniversary edition come out. And I do think there's lots of us that still have it on our shelf. It was on every shelf in Berkeley when I was living here in the 70s. But also so incredible to hear both the parallel between what you were saying that's happening in the state of California with your meeting coming up, but also the story you just told about Southern India, where the people, the grassroots, are taking it to the place where then the politicians have to pay attention. And my question about that is, Anna, you were so right that the climate movement has not encompassed agriculture. The climate negotiations haven't included it, really. Where do you see the openings, the edge to get it into federal policy here in the US, but also to be getting taken more seriously at the international climate negotiations, such that finance and other flows go to this kind of incredible grassroots movement that you've seen everywhere?
Great question. And not to put you on your spot, do you want to introduce yourself and say your connection to the book?
My name's Claire Greensfelder, and one of my greatest honors in life is having in the first edition 5, but in the 50th edition, 4 recipes in Diet for a Small Planet. Which published in a East Bay newspaper called the East Bay Voice, a New American Movement socialist paper back in the 70s here in Berkeley. So it's a great privilege.
Claire, you were more than just recipe contributor. You were an encourager. You helped me so much. So I just want you to know that.
Well, and I'll tell you a secret. I baked a batch of Betty the Peacenik gingerbread before coming, so I'll have it out there available for people who are getting their books signed, in case you want to have a taste of Diet for a Small Planet.
And what was the name of that recipe?
Betty the Peacenik gingerbread.
There you go.
Well, I'll jump in. And so your question about kind of how the climate movement hasn't talked about food, and how can we do more so. Again, sense of possibility. When I started reporting Diet for a Hot Planet, some colleagues of mine did an analysis of the coverage of climate in the biggest American newspapers and looked at the 4,365 articles that have been written right after Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth came out. And they analyzed how many of them even talked about food, mentioned it as part of the problem, or mentioned it as part of the solution. And probably no surprise to any of you, it was like 1.5% of these articles were talking about it. Flash forward to today, and there's so much more of a conversation, not as much as I would like to see, but there's much more of an understanding of that food. You have to address the food impacts on climate, and that there are these really powerful solutions. I just wrote a piece about the new Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out earlier this year. I wrote a piece and interviewed some of the lead authors, a few of the chapters for it, about what does the new IPCC report say about agroecology. And it was so encouraging that in this new IPCC report, agroecology plays a central role in the story of how farmers can mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. Now, has that percolated up to federal policy here or in every country around the world? Not yet. But the fact that now you have the IPCC, talking about agroecology, mainstreaming it, and the lead author I interviewed, the lead author on one of the chapters that focuses so much on it, when I interviewed her, I said, do you feel like this is a real leap from how the IPCC has talked about this in the past? And she said, absolutely. So there is that. There's another organization here in California that's been really beta testing climate policy in a great way, is the California Climate and Agriculture Network. And they help to do incredible work to help farmers in this state move to more regenerative and ecological practices. So it's happening. It needs to happen faster and more, but it is happening.
We're at about a minute before 3. So Frances, would you like to make what do you want to say to people? I had a little note. Please say to the audience 3 things you'd like them to, 3 action items moving forward.
Ooh. 3 action items. I don't know if I can do that. I feel the message though that I like to convey is what happened to me with this when I was 26, and realizing that everything I put in my mouth every day connected me to the earth and connected me to other people and to either worsening or helping the problem. I think this worldview that those of you who are here today, that you were drawn here, would share, as a German friend of mine said, Frankie, in biological systems, there are no parts, only participants. And the realization that every choice we make and don't make is rippling out, and that we are all, someone's watching every choice, and sees what we're doing, and the influence that we have will go far beyond what we think it could. And in that vein, I would like to also return to the foundational word that the Indian women said to me. What really made the difference is that we found our courage by working together. And so if any of us, and I find this all the time for me, are really uncertain and scared about how to best use our time, and scared about the future, to find a buddy, at least one, who's asking the same questions, and find here, because in this rich community, others with whom you can ask that question and then do something that you thought you could not do. And try. Eleanor Roosevelt said, one of her beautiful statements, do something every day that scares you, right? I can't say I do that, but every day, but that spirit, I think, of risk-taking is so important, but we all need buddies to take risks, right? So those are my thoughts I'd like really to share as we close.
That is the perfect close, and they will be signing books out at the Green Apple book table outside, and I cannot thank the two of you enough for joining the book festival here on Mother's Day and all of you who came today.
And thank you,
And
Davia.
forward
Thank you,
ever,
Davia.
right? Forward together.
Thank you. Thank you. What a Mother's Day.